And good evening, everyone. My name is Andy Onison with the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at Berkshire Community College. We're a membership organization of over 1,400 bright, engaged adults aged 50 and better in the Berkshires of Western Massachusetts and beyond. Every year, we offer a series of 5 semesters of courses, both online and in person, as well as a distinguished speaker series, cultural outings, community engagement, author talks, and much more. As I've mentioned, we are in webinar format for tonight's talk, which means you won't be able to turn your cameras or microphones on. But again, please feel free to put any questions or comments into the chat at any time. And with that, it is my pleasure to introduce longtime frequent OLLI instructor, Doug Mishkin.
Thank you, Andy. In the preface to his new book, Say It Loud, on race, law, history, and culture, Professor Randall Kennedy writes that there are 3 beliefs, sometimes in tension with one another, that infuse the book. First, racism continues to be a major force in America. Second, there is much to be inspired by when surveying the African-American journey from slavery to freedom. Third, social relations are complex and messy. He concludes the preface by saying, I luxuriate in the messiness. I savor the paradox and irony. I try to share with readers my sense of surprise, ambivalence, and humility while seeking to understand the race line in American life. Tonight, we get to join Professor Kennedy in luxuriating in the messiness while savoring the paradox and irony. He is the Michael R. Klein Professor at the Harvard Law School. He graduated from Princeton and the Yale Law School with a stint in between as a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford. He clerked for 2 interesting and important federal judges, one of whom you've all heard of, one of whom few of you have heard of. More about that later, time permitting. I invited Professor Kennedy to join us tonight because, although he does not know this, I am his student. I am his student thanks largely to his marvelous regular presentations at the New York Historical Society, as well as to his writing. For an hour, you get to be his students too. Say It Loud, the book, is a collection of 29 of his essays. Time will not permit us to go essay by essay, but I do want to start at the beginning. Professor Kennedy, welcome. Thank you for joining us. The first essay in the book is Shall We Overcome? Optimism and Pessimism in African-American Racial Thought. I'd like to begin by having you talk to us about optimism and pessimism, both of the people you discuss in the essay and of your own.
First of all, thanks so much for having me on. I look forward to our conversation and interaction with our audience. You asked me about the first essay on optimism and pessimism. The reason why I began the book with this essay is because I wanted to begin the book with an essay that would capture and try to make sense of a lot of the commentary that has been written and spoken about the race question in American life over the centuries. And I thought that one way of organizing this huge amount of commentary would be to divide this commentary into 2 camps. The optimistic camp. The optimistic camp is the camp that says we shall overcome, despite our history of racial oppression, we shall overcome. And then there's the pessimistic tradition that says, no, unfortunately, we shall not overcome. Our past has poisoned our future. So I talk about, let's start with the pessimistic tradition, because the pessimistic tradition is actually, I think, in certain ways, the more interesting tradition. So I focus a lot on African American thinkers in this essay, but not exclusively. So among the pessimists would be Alexis de Tocqueville. So for instance, in Democracy in America, de Tocqueville has a chapter called The Three Races of America. And it is disturbingly pessimistic. I mean, basically, de Tocqueville's position was that he thought that Native Americans would be wiped out entirely. He thought that there would be race war between blacks and whites. He thought that there would never be racial equality in the United States. And the reason he thought that is because he basically said he came from an aristocratic society, but in Europe, if there was a change in regime, you couldn't really just automatically know who was on top and who was on the bottom. You couldn't look at somebody and immediately know that their parents were, for instance, serfs. He said, in America, you'll always know that the darker skinned people were slaves. And so he thought that there would never be racial equality in the United States. Another person, Thomas Jefferson, you read his notes on the state of Virginia. Jefferson, thoroughly pessimistic. Another one, Abraham Lincoln. That's why Lincoln was always interested in colonization throughout his life, as a politician, very interested in colonization, because he did not think that there could be racial equality in the United States. Even after the abolition of slavery, he thought that he thought that white people would lord it over black people, and that we would never, blacks and whites would never be able to occupy the same polity as equal neighbors. So those are three white thinkers that were thoroughly pessimistic. Among black thinkers in the black nationalist tradition, you have pessimists, some of whom took the position that, well, we should go back to Africa, or black people should go someplace else, because they will never be truly at home in the United States of America. So in the 19th century, you have black nationalists. In the 20th century, you have Marcus Garvey, you have Elijah Muhammad, you have Malcolm X, you have my colleague Derek Bell, who has been in the news quite a bit lately because he was, one of the progenitors of critical race theory. Derek Bell had the idea that America would permanently be a racist society. Now, you do, and I'll add one other person. Very close to me. My father. My father was a thoroughgoing pessimist. His belief was that this has been and will be a white man's country, and he was thoroughly pessimistic, and voiced that throughout my childhood and my adolescence. And so that idea, that pessimism, has been with me for a long time. Now, there is the optimistic camp. In the 19th century, the great spokesperson for optimism was Frederick Douglass. Even before the abolition of slavery, Frederick Douglass was asked, do you foresee a time when blacks and whites will be able to be true neighbors in the United States of America, when they can share power, they can interact as, they can be friends, they can be neighbors, they can be equals. And even before the abolition of slavery, he said, yeah, I can foresee such a time. In the 20th century, the great spokesperson for optimism was Martin Luther King Jr. And you could go to any number of speeches by Martin Luther King Jr. I'll mention two. One, August 1963, I Have a Dream, one of the great texts for optimism in the racial optimism in the United States. And then that's 1963. 5 years later, in the spring of 1968, hours before he's killed, Martin Luther King Jr. says, I've been to the mountaintop. I've seen the promised land. I might not get there with you, but I have glimpsed the promised land. Thoroughgoing optimist. In the 21st century, probably the most consequential racial optimist would be Barack Obama. Yes, we can. Now, I have been I have been an optimist for my adult life. And I've been a strong optimist, a confident optimist. And indeed, there have been times in my writing where I've gotten really rather indignant in grappling with pessimists. That's changed somewhat. I am still in the optimistic camp, but I am a chastened optimist because of what has happened in the past few years. And I am a worried optimist. I did not think that we would be confronting certain questions that we are confronting right now. And so I'm an optimist, but I'm an optimist with trepidation.
You write in the essay about W.B. Du Bois. We have a question from one of our participants. We in the Berkshires are very proud. He was a Great Barrington guy.
Yeah.
Talk briefly about Du Bois on the optimism-pessimism scale.
Du Bois, what an interest. I mean, Du Bois, the greatest intellectual activist in Black American ranks in American history. Absolutely extraordinary person. I would say that, Du Bois is so interesting. He's sort of like Frederick Douglass. These were people who were so skilled, so articulate that you can pick out part of their work, and it's a great articulation of optimism. So, for instance, W.B. Du Bois was one of the founders of the NAACP. And much of what he wrote, much of what he did, was to mobilize public opinion with the idea that an educated American public would be able to overcome racism. And so there was much of his career that you could view as optimistic. On the other hand, how does he end up? He dies abroad. He repudiates the United States of America. One way in which he repudiated the United States of America was to become a communist. He figured, well, what can I do to show in the most vivid way possible my contempt for the United States of America? He became a member of the Communist Party. He leaves the United States. He embraces the Soviet Union. So, Du Bois is an interesting character, but I'd say ultimately he is in the pessimistic camp.
Right. I want to ask you about one more thing you said in this essay before we move on to another. When you say toward the end of the essay, you've abandoned much, but not all of your quasi-religious faith and optimism. You say, I no longer propound the notion of an ethical obligation to be hopeful. Can you say a word about that ethical obligation?
Yes, I think that in American intellectual life and political life, one encounters statements suggesting that you're morally deficient if you're not optimistic. So, for instance, I mentioned Barack Obama, whom I respect very deeply, but Barack Obama speaks as if it's a moral imperative to be hopeful, to be optimistic. And for a long time, by the way, I embraced that position. For instance, I wrote a piece a number of years ago that was quite critical of Ta-Nehisi Coates. And in my piece, one of the bases for my criticism was that, well, I said, he's so pessimistic that he's going to depress people, and if people are depressed, they're less likely to be active. Well, I've changed on this. In my view, if you're writing as a social analyst, you write as a social analyst. And you're not writing as a therapist. You're not writing as a minister. You're not writing as a cheerleader. You're writing as a social analyst. And if your analysis leads you to say at the end, no hope, well, okay, no hope. I mean, the question is your analysis apt? Is your analysis accurate? The question of, whether you're hopeful or not, it seems to me that's for religion. That's for something else. It's not for social analysis.
Right. Right. Let's move to a group of essays in this point. You have 3 essays in the book that share a theme, the theme of names. Mm-hmm. You have the struggle for collective naming, the struggle for personal naming, and the 3rd essay is Nigger, the strange career continues. Mm-hmm. I'd like to talk about all 3 and start by talking about the struggle for collective naming, because you touch on the terms African, colored, Negro, capitalization of Negro, Black, the capitalization of Black, and African American. Talk to us about this struggle for collective naming.
Yeah, this is an important point for me. The first sentence in the book touches on this issue. The very first sentence in the book reads, "The writings that follow are the impressions of a Black, Negro, colored, African American law professor born in Columbia, South Carolina in 1954. So, in that very first sentence, I was gesturing towards controversy involving collective naming. Let me tell you a little bit about how this essay was written. I was giving a lecture at my school, Harvard Law School, and in the middle of the lecture, a student raised her hand, and I called on her, and she said, "Professor Kennedy, you've used the word Negro a number of times, and my question is, are you using this term in its historic context to avoid, anachronism? Are you just using it in that way, just for historical authenticity, or are you using the term yourself as a term fit for present day usage?" And I said, "Oh, that's a very interesting question." And I said, "Actually, I'm doing both." And then she said, "Well, if you are using this term for present day usage, I just want you to know that I'm offended. I'm offended and I object." And I said, "That's very interesting. Let me go on with my lecture. I will take what you just said under advisement and I'll get back to you." Well, about a couple of weeks later, I did some research, the research that's really the basis for this essay. And a couple of weeks later, I gave a lecture on the history of collective names. Why was it that in the 17th century, for instance, well, actually in the early 18th century, why was it that Black Americans stopped putting Africa or African in the names of their institutions? Why was it that people stopped using colored? Why is it that people stopped using Negro? I just went through all of these various terms and the controversies around them. To make a long story short, though, to get back to the question of Negro, I said, I can date when I started actually using Negro consistently in my written work. And the date is 1983-84. That's when I started using this term consistently in my written work. And the reason why I used it consistently in my written work was because it was insisted upon by my boss. My boss insisted that I use the term Negro, capital N. My boss was a very distinguished jurist. His name was Thurgood Marshall, Mr. Civil Rights. And I know this because the first time that the justice had 4 clerks, we'd been working for him for a couple of weeks, and then after a couple of weeks, he brought us in basically to sort of lay down his rules. And I'd written a memorandum. It was some case, I forget exactly the nature of the case, but it required me to designate the race of the parties. And I referred to one of the parties as African American. And he says, I use Negro, capital N. Now, my point is, this was 1983-84. It wasn't a long time ago. 1983, in my lifetime, coming from Mr. Civil Rights. My view was, if it was good enough for Thurgood Marshall, if it was good enough for Martin Luther King Jr., if it was good enough for W.E.B. Du Bois, if it was good enough for my grandmother, it's good enough for me. And frankly, I use, in my view, what matters is the attitude with which one uses these terms. So in my writing, and like I say, in the very first sentence of this book, I'm basically giving a hint. I use all these terms because I don't want to just keep using the same term over and over and over again. It's, word fatigue. Partly for aesthetic reasons, I like to vary my word usage. And so, yeah, I use Negro, I use Black, I even use colored, and that really bothers some people, but I do. I mean, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People still exists, right. Wonderful organization. I don't see that there's anything derogatory about using the term colored. So in any event, this is what I talk about in that essay. The second essay is an essay about personal naming. And I found that so interesting. I mean, and it shed such a light on Black American history. I mean, when there were many Black Americans who, in the age of slavery, were burdened with names that were imposed upon them. That's why after the end of slavery, there were a good many Black Americans who changed their names and, opted for new names. And this question of naming has been historically a really vexed issue. And not just naming, but not only with names, but also with modes of address. One of my favorite cases from the Second Reconstruction is a very, I think for many people, it would be viewed as a marginal case, a rather unimportant case. It's a case called Hamilton versus Alabama. And here's what happened. A Black woman from New York City goes south. She's working for the Congress of Racial Equality. She's engaged in a in a protest. She's arrested. At her trial, I think she was tried for maybe trespass, disorderly conduct, something like that. She's being tried, and the prosecutor, called a solicitor in Alabama, the solicitor says to her, "Mary, why were you arrested?" And the response comes back, "My name is Miss Mary Hamilton." And she said that because she had heard the solicitor refer to the white people, the white witnesses, by their surnames. But then he says to her, with all this, sort of familiarity, over familiarity, Mary. And she just says, "Nope, my name is Miss Mary Hamilton." And then he says again, "Mary, why were you arrested?" And she says, "My name is Miss Mary Hamilton." At that point, the solicitor turns to the judge and says, "Judge, please instruct the witness to respond." And the judge turns to her and says, "Well, your name is, Mary Hamilton, so it's okay for him to call you Mary. Respond, and if you do not respond, I'm going to hold you in criminal contempt of court. So respond." And she says, "My name is Miss Mary Hamilton." He holds her immediately in criminal contempt. She goes to jail for 60 days. Her case, her contempt is affirmed by the Alabama Supreme Court, but then it goes up to the Supreme Court of the United States, where it is summarily reversed. But she's already spent the 60 days in jail. I love that case because the facts are so simple and so stark, but it shows this issue of address, this issue of identification. This lady was willing to go to jail to be addressed in the way that she saw fit. And so, so in any event, that's part of that second essay.
I want to interject for all of you who are watching and listening tonight. What you just got was the Reader Digest version of Professor Kennedy's treatment of the Mary Hamilton case. And I urge you, when we're finished tonight, go to the podcast that's put out by the New York Historical Society and find his lecture on the case of Mary Hamilton. It's great storytelling, and you can appreciate even in greater depth the significance of that case that otherwise most of us have never heard of, right? Enough of a plug for the New York Historical Society. The third of the essay is about naming. In 2002, you wrote a book called "Nigger, the Strange Career of a Troublesome Word." Your essay is entitled "Nigger, the Strange Career Continues." We could take the rest of tonight talking about the strange career. Give us a few minutes worth on the strange career and what interests you about it.
Yes. Well, 20 years ago, I thought that it would be interesting to learn more about this notorious word. This word is probably the most well-known slur in the world. It's known the world over. And 20 years ago, I remember just being in my office and thinking, well, where does this word come from? And, in the law, what's happened with this word? And first I did some work on the history of the word, but I'm a lawyer, so I went to a computer and instructed the computer basically to give me every law case in which this word had figured. There were thousands of cases, thousands. And what these cases show is a number of things. Number one, these cases show that even, in the 20th century, this word, Nigger, nigger, is in the backdrop. It's part of the soundtrack for numerous episodes of racial atrocity in America. I'm talking about murders, I'm talking about rapes, I'm talking about arson, I'm talking about terrorism of various sorts, I'm talking about people being harassed at the workplace, I'm talking about police misconduct. This word is in the backdrop. And so one of the things that I sought to do 20 years ago, and one of the things that I do in this essay is say, number one, do recognize, everybody needs to know that this is a word that has been used in terrible ways, in ways in which this word has blood dripping off of it. So know that. And so I give lots of instances. I insist on showing this with particularity, showing this with vividness. That's point one. Point two, and by the way, point one, I invest a lot of effort into making point one. Point one is not all that controversial, to tell you the truth. People understand that point. Right. The second point is controversial because the second point says that this word, if you just thought of this word as a slur, it would be worth a book because it's an important slur. And the way in which this word has been used as a weapon of racism warrants a book. Okay, fine. I write a lot about that. But it's even more interesting because this term, like all terms, like all symbols, can be put to other uses. So I say I've shown you that this word can be put to racist uses, but now let me show you that it has been put to other uses. So what other uses has it been put to? Well, you can read Dick Gregory's memoir. What's the name of Dick Gregory? Dick Gregory, for folks that don't know, Dick Gregory was a comedian, a social activist in the 1960s. He devoted a lot of his time to the Civil Rights Revolution. He was an anti-racist, and he was a very fine comedian. And his first memoir was called Nigger, a Memoir. Now, was he engaged in racism? No, he was engaged in the opposite. He titled that book basically to hold up a mirror to America, and he was trying to shame America, and he was trying to bring home racism in American life and the horrible nature of racism in American life and the need to overcome racism in American life. So, okay, that's Dick Gregory. Who else? Well, one can turn to others who've used this term. Martin Luther King Jr. in Letter from a Birmingham Jail and in other writings and other speeches, he talks about the term nigger. Is he using it in a racist way? No, just the opposite. He mentions it to drive home the point that it has been used in a racist way. He's not using it in a racist way. He's portraying its use. If one takes a look at the work of, Ralph Ellison, James Baldwin, James Baldwin, there was a documentary film called I Am Not Your Negro. That's not what James Baldwin said. The producer of that film, Bowdlerized Baldwin. Baldwin said, I am not your nigger. And you can go on YouTube and see Baldwin saying this. He was very intentional. Was he using it in a racist way? No, he was using it in an anti-racist way. One of my favorite comedians, Richard Pryor. Richard Pryor had a great album, That Nigger's Crazy. One of the great satirical pieces in American literature. That Nigger's Crazy. Is he being racist? Is he trying to put black people down? No. Now, it is true that later in his career, Richard Pryor repudiated his earlier use of the infamous N-word. That's true. But in my view, the funnier Richard Pryor, the Richard Pryor that told us more about American life, was the Richard Pryor who used this word in a satiric way. So my point is, this is a term that has been used, and one other thing, rap music. I mean, you listen to, I don't know, Dr. Dre. In the last Super Bowl, he was the biggest star of halftime. Great rapper. The infamous N-word is all in the lyrics of Dr. Dre and Snoop and NWA and 50 Cent, and one could go on and on and on. Are these people being racist? I don't think so. They're using this word a different way. So that's the second point that I make. And the third point I make is, therefore, what's the therefore? The therefore is one has to be careful and make distinctions. In my view, you cannot say that every use of this word is wrong because every use of this word is racist. No. Some people are being racist in the way they use the word, but some people are not. And it seems to me that one needs to distinguish between the two. Those are the 3 points really that I make in that essay.
I want to move on. You clerked for 2 interesting and important judges, one of whom you've mentioned, but I want to ask you to talk about the judge who I suspect most people listening tonight don't know of, Judge Skelly Wright. Mm-hmm. And your essay is entitled J. Skelly Wright, Up from Racism. Can you take just a couple minutes and tell us about Judge Wright?
Sure. So after I graduated from law school, I had the distinct privilege of clerking for probably the 2 most progressive federal judges then sitting, and probably in all of American history, J. Skelly Wright, United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit, and then Thurgood Marshall. Let me talk about J. Skelly Wright first. J. Skelly Wright is a white man born in New Orleans, came up under rather modest circumstances. He wasn't poor. I mean, he was college educated and went to the Loyola Law School, worked at night as a school teacher, and became an important lawyer in New Orleans. He became the United States Attorney in New Orleans. He became a United States District Court judge. One of J. Skelly Wright's claims to fame is that J. Skelly Wright was the first United States district judge to order the desegregation of a school system in a major city in the Deep South. He ordered Bush versus Orleans Parish. J. Skelly Wright ordered the desegregation of the New Orleans school system. And this was in, I think, 1961. And this caused a political earthquake in Louisiana. There was a point at which I think he held the entire state legislature in contempt of court. I mean, he went toe to toe with the legislature. He became a notorious figure in Louisiana, and he was put under armed guard. And he had a really extraordinary career. When John Kennedy became president, he was very impressed by Judge Wright, and he wanted to elevate Judge Wright to the United States Court of Appeals. But the two senators in Louisiana took the position over our dead bodies. No way, we're not going to allow this guy to be put on the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit. And so the Kennedy administration worked out a deal whereby he could be on a court of appeals, but not in the Deep South. He was put on a court of appeals in the District of Columbia. And he became, as a United States Court of Appeals judge, a crusading liberal, very sympathetic to racial minorities, very sympathetic to women plaintiffs who were attacking sexism in the law, very sympathetic to organized labor, very progressive with respect to environmental issues, a thoroughgoing progressive. Now, one of the things that I think is somewhat interesting in my essay is I point out, to get back to the title, Up from Racism, I point out that at the very time that J. Skelly Wright was ordering the desegregation of the schools in New Orleans, he had an interview with a British journalist. British journalist goes down to New Orleans, wants to interview Judge Wright, because what was happening in New Orleans was just so extraordinary. I mean, here's this, Judge Wright very important legal figure. He's got it made. He's a big shot. He's thoroughly admired, yet he issues these orders which challenge the racial orthodoxy of the time. Well, this British reporter is talking with him, and Judge Wright in this interview says that, I don't socialize with black people. I don't socialize with black people. And Judge Wright says, if I shake a black person's hand, frankly, it makes me feel funny. Now, I gave a version of this essay at an event in Judge Wright's honor. It was, like I said, he went to Loyola Law School, and at Loyola Law School, they erected a statue in his honor. And by the way, up until then, there was no memorialization of J. Skelly Wright anywhere in New Orleans. So, and this just happened a few years ago at Loyola. They put up a statue, and they set aside a weekend for people to come talk about Judge Wright, and they invited me. And I talked about this interview, and I said, either, in my view, either one of two things was going on. Either Judge Wright was trying to communicate to his neighbors that he really wasn't so, different from them. He was trying to signal that, don't think of me as a real weirdo. I'm not comfortable socializing with black people either. Either he was doing that, or he was being completely straightforward and just saying, I'm not comfortable being around black people. And what I said was, I think it's highly likely that the latter was the case. I think it's highly likely that in early 1960s, that's right, he hadn't been around black people. He had ruled in favor of Brown versus Board, the enforcement of Brown versus Board of Education. But, that didn't make him a racial egalitarian. But in my view, I thought that in a way it showed his greatness, that as an adult he could change. And not only was he an adult, but he was a very successful adult. He was a big deal. Yet over the course of the 1960s, he became one of the most progressive jurists in the United States. And I give him a lot of credit for that. I worked for him in 1982, 83. And again, it was a great privilege.
Given our time constraint, I want to say to our listeners, I know I'm doing an injustice to every one of these essays that one way or another is about justice. And you touched on Justice Marshall, but I do want to get us to one last chapter that I want to call your attention to, namely the last chapter in the book, entitled Racial Promised Lands with a question mark. You begin by talking about different visions of racial justice, right? The white supremacism of George Wallace, the black separatism of Elijah Muhammad, the Black Power Initiative articulated by Stokely Carmichael and others, and then the concept of color blindness. In a few minutes that we have left, I'd like for people to hear from you. What do you make of these different visions, and what has it meant for your own view of the world?
Yeah,
that's a large question, I understand, but I pleaded guilty to injustice at the beginning.
Well, I ended the book with this essay on purpose, Racial Promised Lands, question mark. I wanted to do two things. One, I wanted to set forth the idea that people have had competing visions of what would be a just racial order in the United States. John C. Calhoun believed that racial slavery was a positive good. I mean, in his view, a good racial order was a racial order in which whites were on top as slave owners and blacks were subordinate as enslaved people. Well, that's one conception. There have been many conceptions, and I don't think that we think about that enough. I think we often use terms. We say, we're in favor of racial equality. Well, I mean, what does that mean? What exactly do you mean when you say racial equality? Does that mean that everybody is treated the same? That's, I think that a lot of people would say, yeah, that sounds good. Everybody's treated the same. Well, okay. Now, if you say that everybody's going to be treated exactly the same, from this moment on, we're treating everybody the same. Okay. There's a certain sort of virtue in that. On the other hand, does that mean that we're going to treat exactly the same people who are still bearing the debilitating scars of past racial oppression? Are they to be treated the same as people who are the beneficiaries of past racial oppression? Well, then immediately we get into the controversies that so vex us. Immediately we get into controversies about I don't know, reparations or affirmative action or, you know, the rest of it. So what I wanted to do was to just say that we need to be more mindful of our words. We need to be more careful in delineating what really do we want. Do we want a society in which we view really everyone the same, regardless of their apparent, you know, racial affiliation? Some people would say, yeah, that's, you know, yeah, that's exactly what we should want. Okay, well, if that's what we should want, what happens then to various organizations? What happens to the National Association of Black Social Workers? What happens to the Congressional Black Caucus? What happens to the, and you could just go, you know, Native American groups, various groups, you know, Asian American groups, Latino groups. When the revolution comes, do these groups maintain their names? Do people still group up that way? Do we want a society in which people affiliate themselves to any extent pursuant to their perceived racial affiliation? These are ideas that I don't think we talk about enough, because I think we generalize too much. We sweep a lot of stuff sort of under the cover and use broad terms without coming to brass tacks in a very particular way. One last thing I'll say is, I wanted to end the book with this essay also, because, you know, I did the best I can with the essay, but I'm not altogether satisfied with it. I don't give an altogether satisfying. I don't give a response to the question that is altogether satisfying to me. I mean, you know, if somebody says to me, Kennedy, tell me what your idea of the racial promised land looks like. You know, what are its boundaries? How do people act when they're there? I can hum a few bars, but only a few.
Well, interesting that you should say that, because I very much want to share with our audience what you wrote toward the end of that essay, which is in effect toward the end of the book. And you wrote, at the outset of writing these comments, I felt embarrassed by the undeveloped state of my own imaginings. Even after years of study, I am bereft of a satisfactory answer to the question, what racial order do I want? I was abashed by the absence of a map in my own mind detailing a racial promised land, but my sentiments have changed. I have become much less enamored of the idea of a grand design.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that last sentence is just to go to the very beginning of our time together. That last sentence is connected to my feeling of being a chastened optimist. The fact of the matter is, at this moment, again, I feel that our democracy is in tremendous peril. And my ambitions have actually been lowered. I guess I'm not as much of a maximalist as I used to be. I'm more of a minimalist, and I have all sorts of uncertainties now that I didn't have, let's say, 15 years ago.
You remind me of a rabbi I once heard who said, I'm an agnostic and I've got a lot of evidence to back up my doubts. And I must say, it may not be your purpose, but I believe part of the effect of what you do, particularly in this essay, but overall, you comfort the afflicted and you afflict the comfortable. And for those of us who in our own lives, in our own ways, struggle with these questions, to hear you describe your own continued struggle with the grand question, like a racial promised land question mark, is somewhat comforting. That those of us who aren't scholars in the field and don't do this for a living, but simply think about these questions because we want to be better people, better citizens, we're struggling in our own way. And it's nice to know that somebody like you can be so clear about your continued struggle with some of these questions. We have just a couple of minutes left. I'm happy to offer you the floor for any of your own closing thoughts. There's plenty going on in terms of current events that people might want to hear you talk about. It occurs to me we have controversy about a nominee for the Supreme Court. We have controversy about a sitting justice. We have the Academy Awards, but we also have yesterday President Biden signing into law the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act. So if I can put my thumb on the scale a little bit, let me give you the floor for a few final comments before I wrap up.
Sure. Well, first, I want to thank you again for inviting me to this forum. I especially like events like this because events like this attract active audiences. That's one of the reasons why you mentioned the New York Historical Society. Love it. People come because they want to come and they're interested. They learn things, and I hear from people all the time who give me tips, who give me, offer criticisms from which I learn. So thank you for this forum. You mentioned the bill signed yesterday. What a perfect, let's go out on that. On the one hand, it's really good. I'm really glad that, President Biden was able to sign this bill, this federal anti-lynching bill. That's good. At the same time, it's being signed now, frankly, when the need is least. When it would have been most effective, when it would have been most useful, of course, it couldn't get through the Senate of the United States. This is a bill that was stopped time after time after time. And the fact that, so the Senate could unanimously approve it. Well, why couldn't it do that 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago? We all know the reason. And it is a reason that brings us face to face with a sobering reality about American life, which is that racial oppression in American life goes deep, and it is still with us in various ways. We still have a lot of work to do, and I look forward to joining you and the folks that are with us in this session in trying to make our country a better country. Again, thank you very much for having me on.
Well, Professor Kennedy, thank you. Thank you for joining us tonight, for your scholarship, for your writing, your speaking, but especially for your role as a teacher of the public. Thank you for bringing us into the messiness with you, helping us appreciate the paradox and the irony. And in so doing, you show us how race, law, history, and culture have made America what it is and possibly what it can be. And I'll give you another tip right now. Keep doing what you've done always, which is say it loud. Thank you to Ali for being a home for this kind of programming. Thanks to all of you who have joined us. See you all around campus. Good night.
Night, night.